Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lewis. Welcome back to my channel. Today, we're going to be continuing the topic of the last episode, which is where I think is the best place for the beginner in jazz to start. Now, what I've done is I've pulled off from my shelves a few more albums, and they're basically to give you some kind of idea of the broad church which appears in jazz. Now, what I've tried to do also is to stick to the criteria which I set out in the previous episode, but just in case you weren't there for that particular episode, I'm going to go over it again. The criteria of albums on display today will be one of the following. The first one's going to be jazz and blues vocals. The second is going to be the West Coast sound, which includes lounge and exotica. The third is going to be Latin and Brazilian jazz, which includes bossa nova. The fourth is going to be modern contemporary jazz, which for arbitrary sake I've started at 1980 to the present. And the last one is going to be mid-tier or consensus jazz. And again, what I mean by this is artists who are standing, who are respected, and who have considerable talent. They're just not considered at the same level as a Coltrane, a Mingus, or a Davis, but they are very good in and of themselves. Now, the first album which I'm going to show you today is something from the blues and jazz vocal section, and that's going to be by George Shearing Quintet with a lady called Dakota Stanton, and the album is called In the Night. Now, this is a really funny album to me. Not amusing, but there's something funny, strange, which has happened on this particular album. Over a course of time, I've purchased this on two occasions. The first time was for about £3, and the second time for about £5. Now, I would say on this album there are only two tracks of merit, but some of the backstory is probably more interesting than the actual album itself. Now, the tracks I'm going to highlight for you is going to be Blues in My Heart and In the Night. Now, the reason for pointing these tunes out is quite the contrast between these two tracks. Now, on the track Blues in My Heart, you get a really good example of the vocal ability of Miss Stanton. She is a power singer, and in my opinion, if she had slight retraining, she could easily be an opera singer. So in this particular track, you get an idea of how good she is, her vocal range, and her personality comes out. But there is a problem with this particular tune. So no matter how good the track is, the last 30 seconds of it, there is a definite problem where it just comes off the rails. There is a problem between the vocal and the piano arrangements where once you hear it, you can't unhear it. And I have no idea how this has come about, but it's interesting that it did. But like I said, have a listen for yourself. Maybe it's just me, but certainly I think that there is a disconnect, or the actual track falls off the rails in the last 30 seconds of what was a really good track, and it probably would have been the title track on this album. Now, secondly, you have the track In the Night, and why I've mentioned this one is it's a nice track, and when you hear it, you're going to be probably enamored with it. My problem is that once you've heard other tracks by her and you know her ability, the In the Night is too safe. It's like she's dialed it in. She could have been laying on her bed and easily been capable of producing exactly what's on this album. So it's a real shame that for the talent on display, either by Mr. Shearing or by Miss Stanton, that they really didn't exploit how good these artists are on this particular album. So yeah, a strange one. But do have a listen to those two tracks, and if you find it on vinyl, try not to spend too much money, but you should be able to find it on CD as well as a lot of the streaming services. The second album I'm going to talk about is the West Coast Sound, and this is an album by session musicians, and the album's called Continental Jazz, and the artists themselves, or the ensemble, is called Les Cinq Modernes. So those who were here for the first video will already recognize I'm terrible at foreign languages. So you're going to have to bear with me once again as I butcher another language. But on this particular album, which I spent maybe £4 to £5 on, yeah, it's a lovely sound. It's a really good example of the lounge kind of exotica sound, but more loungy than anything. You got some really good artists on here, and I'm sure if I did some further research, I'll find that there are some names here which have been on more creditable albums. But one of the artists who are on this album, and it did surprise me, is a gentleman called Paul Horn, who is a really talented saxophonist and clarinet player, also very good on the flute. And you're going to hear in a couple of episodes time, maybe the next one of his solo albums, and you'll hear for yourself how good he is. So that was a real surprise. This is an album which is material derived from French and Italian traditions. I would say, in terms of content, that the French side of this album is much better than the Italian side. So on this album, I would highlight the following tracks: Petit Fantasy, Petit Fleur, and Blanc sur Blanc. I would say those are the three outstanding tracks on this particular album. But when I do listen to this album, which is quite frequently, it conjures up in my mind driving a convertible along coastal roads in Nice, Saint-Tropez and Cannes, that kind of thing. It's a really nice, rich sound. So if you do see this album, either on one of the streaming channels or on CD, again, be aware of the price. This vinyl, as I said, was no more than £5. £5 to £8. I say try and stick at the £5 mark. You can't go wrong there. Anything more than you kind of got a bit, wince a bit, go, well, I'm not sure if this is for me. But yeah, around the £5 mark, I would highly recommend it. And it's a really good example of the lounge sound of that particular time. The third album I'd like to show you today will be along the lines of the Latin and Brazilian jazz side of things. So this is an album by the Latin Jazz Quintet, and it's an album called Latin Soul. Fantastic cover, as you can see. This particular one I purchased for about £14. And once I bought it, I didn't look back. I think this is a really good album, and it's split into two. There's 8 tracks, 4 of which are original compositions, 4 of which are the material of other artists. Now, the tracks which are the result of other artists' work, which are really nicely interpreted on this particular album. They do it with a level of respect, but yet they do it with flair. And I do like to hear the percussion and Latin flavour that they've infused these jazz standards with. It's really good. Now, the original compositions on here, they're treated slightly differently, and what I mean by that, there's more of a contribution by the entire group on those particular tracks, the original compositions. So they're set free a bit more, and they certainly sound more of the Latin flavour, and they should do, to be quite honest. Of note on this particular album, there are 2 artists by the name of Bobby Capers and Artie Jenkins on saxophone and piano respectively, who I really do think are they basically dominate this album by way of their individual talents. It's a really nice thing to behold where you see two artists really going for it. Also of note is on this particular album there's a credit for a gentleman called Rudy Van Gelder. Now that might not mean anything to you at this point, but as you get further into jazz you will find his name cropping up, and basically his name is synonymous with quality. He has his own particular style as a producer. I would liken him for the contemporary version, or more contemporary version of him would be like a Quincy Jones type thing. But yeah, certainly if you see his name associated with a product, you're pretty much going to know that it's very good. Now the three tracks I would highlight from this particular album will be Blues Waltz, Rip a Dip and Monk's Bread. So that's one standard and two original compositions out of those three. So give them a whirl. Like I said, around the £13 mark for this one. If you do see it on CD on the streaming sites, do give it a listen, see if it's for you. But I'm an advocate of the kind of Brazilian Latin scene, so it was a no-brainer for me to get it. But hopefully you feel the same, and if you do, yeah, go for it. Yeah, you should be able to find it on all formats, I would hope. The fourth album I'd like to talk to you about is from the Contemporary Jazz section. Now, if you were here for the previous episode, you'll realise that I've had mixed feelings about this particular section of jazz. Because it's so new, I'm not sure how to interpret the material from this section as of yet. I'm still working on it, and I don't think that's a problem still to be working on it. But this is a gentleman called Chip Wickham and his album Shamal Wind. Now, as I said, with the earlier album, an album from the previous episode by a gentleman called Matthew Halsall, I observed that maybe my problem with the album is that it's too modern sounding. Now, in contrast, this one, if you was to give me a blind test and ask me what era this particular album comes from, I would have said it was a much older album than what it actually is. So realizing that, I'm still trying to work out if I like that or not. Yeah, how weird. Yeah, funny thing is, Mr. Halsall actually appears on this particular album. He's on one of the tracks called The Mirage. So seeing as I'm here, I'll tell you the outstanding tracks in my opinion. It'll be the title track Shamal Wind, Soho Strut and Barrio 71. Undoubtedly, the musicians do have you can tell they love jazz, they're all enthusiasts. Chip himself, you can tell that he really wants to put out good product, and I'm not saying this isn't. I wouldn't have bought it if I thought it was rubbish, and it certainly isn't rubbish. It's very good. I just have to get used to it more than anything. But yes, there is a slight discomfort in my mind with the idea of is the reason that I like it is because it sounds like something else, something from an earlier period. Still working on that one. So this particular album was around the £14 mark. It was from 2018, so hopefully you can still get it on vinyl. I won't go into the £20 mark for this particular album. As good as it is, I won't be paying that amount. Certainly at 14, that's not a problem at all. I would buy it. So if you do see it, give it a go, see what you think. I like to hear your comments on it. And whether you think I'm mad or I've got it spot on, then yeah, do let me know below. The last album I'm going to show you today is from the Midtier Jazz consensus side of things. And this is an album by a gentleman who I've got a number of albums by, but this is one of the albums that I came into contact with probably straight after I'd heard A Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. And that's Stanley Turrentine's West Side Highway. Couldn't see it there for a second. Now, I've got fond memories of this particular album. It's really good. It's here's an example of how good this album is in terms of its the personnel on it. This is super powered. This is over the top talent, and I'm going to give you a few names, some of which you will know, some of which you won't, but you will come to know in the future. And that would be Eric Gale, Cornell Dupree, Ron Carter, Grady Tate, and Hubert Laws. Yeah, that's saying something. So this particular album, as you can see from the cover, is kind of from like the late 70s, early 80s kind of New York scene. Yeah, the reason for mentioning that is because when I actually listened to this particular album, and the following tracks in particular, which are Anne, Wonderful One, Sugar, and Peace of Mind, what it actually conjures up in my mind is the Hammersmith Flyover. Really weird that. Or is it because I've seen this cover and that's the nearest equivalent I can think to it of it? But it seems to work in my mind in any case. Yeah, I just think of an urban sprawl with this particular album. I think of a smell, a heat, as in temperature. I think of the summer. I think of tens of thousands of people in a closely confined space, and they're all having conversations one above another, kind of thing. So there is a certain hum, a din to the environment. Yeah, I just think this is a really good album. This particular one I inherited, this album, so for me it's priceless. I would say if you can find it on vinyl, if it's around the £15-20 mark, I'd give it serious consideration. If you find it above that, then it's kind of like, it's up to you at that point. I would say the 15 to 20 mark is probably closer to what it should be. But yeah, it's a fabulous journey with it. It's in terms of jazz albums, although it's melancholy to a certain extent, it's not overly earnest, which you will find at the top level. So give it a listen. I think it's well worth spending your time, really listening to the tracks that I've highlighted. And please let me know below what you think of it. As I said, I'm slightly biased towards this album, so it'd be nice to hear what your interpretation is of it. So at this point, I'd like to thank you for giving me your time and listening to some of my musings. I do hope they were, or some of which were useful to you. If you've enjoyed the content, please consider subscribing, liking and sharing, and feel free to make comments below. I hope to see you for the next episode, but until then, thank you very much and bye bye.